In 1971, the United States did something that should have destroyed its economy forever. It told the entire world, that gold backing your dollars? Gone. You're just going to have to trust us. Markets panicked. Inflation exploded. Foreign governments demanded answers. And by every economic law in the textbook, the US dollar should have collapsed into irrelevance. But it didn't. In fact, the dollar got stronger. And today, 54 years later, roughly 58% of all global foreign exchange reserves are still held in US dollars. The entire world is still playing by America's rules. So how did that happen? The answer is a secret deal made in the Saudi Arabian desert in 1974 that almost nobody talks about. A deal so consequential that it has shaped every oil spike, every war in the Middle East, and every economic crisis you have lived through. This is the story of the Petrodollar Pact. What I'm about to show you is how a single handshake between the United States and Saudi Arabia created an invisible financial empire that still rules the global economy today. This isn't just history. This is the operating system running underneath every price you pay at the gas pump, every interest rate decision made by the Federal Reserve, and every geopolitical conflict that seems confusing on the surface. By the end of this video, you will understand why Saddam Hussein was invaded, why Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, and why China's moves against the dollar right now have Washington more nervous than anything else on the planet. Let's start at the beginning. To understand the petrodollar, you need to go back to 1944. World War II is winding down, and the great powers of the Allied world gather in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war financial order. The deal they struck was elegant. Every major currency would be pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. It meant that every dollar in circulation was, theoretically, backed by real gold sitting in Fort Knox. This system made the dollar the world's reserve currency. You needed dollars to trade. You needed dollars to borrow. The dollar was effectively as good as gold. But by the late 1960s, the cracks were showing. The Vietnam War was bleeding the US Treasury dry. Lyndon Johnson had launched an ambitious domestic spending program, the Great Society. At the same time, he was pouring billions into Southeast Asia. The US was spending far more than it was earning, and foreign governments, smelling the problem, started cashing in their dollars for actual gold. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, sent a battleship to New York Harbor loaded with French dollars, demanding gold in return. He wasn't alone. By 1971, the gold drain had become a crisis. And on August 15th of that year, President Nixon went on national television and announced what became known as the Nixon shock. He was closing the gold window. The dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. Just like that, the Bretton Woods system, the foundation of the post-war world economy, was dead. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The United States had just walked away from the gold standard. The dollar had no physical backing, and the world had every reason to abandon it. Enter Henry Kissinger. Nixon's Secretary of State was one of the most calculating geopolitical minds of the 20th century, and he understood something critical. If the dollar couldn't be backed by gold, it needed to be backed by something else, something the entire world needed, constantly, desperately. Oil. In 1974, Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And what they negotiated there was one of the most consequential and least discussed deals in modern history. Here is how it worked. The United States offered Saudi Arabia two things: military protection and access to American weapons. In return, Saudi Arabia agreed to do two things. First, price all Saudi oil exclusively in US dollars. Not in pounds, not in marks, not in yen. Dollars. Second, take the surplus petrodollar revenues, the billions of dollars flowing into the kingdom from oil sales, and invest them back into US Treasury bonds, funding American debt directly. By 1975, every member of OPEC had agreed to the same arrangement. Think about what this created. Any country in the world that wanted to buy oil, which is to say every country in the world, first had to acquire US dollars. That created a permanent, structural global demand for the dollar that had absolutely nothing to do with America's economic performance. The dollar didn't need gold anymore. It had oil. Most people have no idea this system exists because it was never codified in a public treaty. It was a quiet agreement reinforced through decades of military relationships, arms sales, and diplomatic pressure. Invisible, but iron. Now here's where it gets worse, because once you understand the system, you start to notice something very uncomfortable. Every major leader in the Middle East who tried to break the petrodollar arrangement ended up destroyed. In the year 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin selling its oil in euros, not dollars. He called it an act of anti-imperialism. Economists at the time largely dismissed it as symbolic. 3 years later, the United States invaded Iraq. Was the invasion about weapons of mass destruction? You know the answer by now. The weapons inspectors found nothing. But within months of the invasion, Iraq's oil was back on the dollar standard. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi proposed something even more dramatic, a pan-African gold-backed currency called the gold dinar, which African nations would use to sell their oil and bypass the dollar entirely. His plan had serious support from several African leaders. In 2011, NATO, led by the United States, intervened in Libya's civil war. Gaddafi was captured and killed. His gold dinar proposal died with him. What frustrates me about this is not the politics. Reasonable people can disagree about the justifications for these interventions. What frustrates me is that the financial dimension of these events is almost never discussed in mainstream coverage. The petrodollar is the dog that didn't bark, always present, never named. Now, fast forward to today, and the system is under the most serious pressure it has ever faced. In March 2022, following Western sanctions imposed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia was cut off from the SWIFT global payment system. It was a financial weapon designed to isolate Russia. But it sent a chilling message to every country that had ever wondered what would happen if Washington turned against them. Your dollar reserves can be frozen. Your access to global trade can be cut off. The dollar system is not neutral infrastructure. It is a geopolitical tool. Since then, the pace of de-dollarization has accelerated sharply. China and Russia have dramatically increased bilateral trade in their own currencies. Saudi Arabia, Yes, the very kingdom that founded the petrodollar system began openly discussing yuan-denominated oil contracts with Beijing in 2023. India has been settling oil trades with Russia in rupees. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now joined by several more nations, has formally discussed creating an alternative to the dollar-based trading system. And here is the number that should stop you cold. In 2001, the US dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves was approximately 73%. By 2024, it had fallen to around 58%. That is a 15-point drop in just over 2 decades. The decline is slow, but it is real, and it is accelerating. Critically, the 50-year petrodollar agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia, which formed the backbone of this entire system, was reported to have quietly lapsed in 2024, with Saudi Arabia choosing not to renew it on the same exclusive terms. The architecture is cracking.
So here is the real takeaway. The petrodollar system was never really about oil. It was about power. Specifically, the power to make the rest of the world fund American debt, finance American spending, and sustain American influence without the constraints of a gold standard. It worked because it was backed by something more reliable than gold, a credible military guarantee and the sheer size of the US economy. But here is what most people still don't realize. The dollar's reserve status is not a law of nature. It is a political agreement. And political agreements can end. The countries that are pushing for alternatives are not doing so because they love China or hate America. They are doing so because the Russian sanctions proved that relying on the dollar means relying on US goodwill. And that is a vulnerability no sovereign nation can accept forever.
So let me leave you with 3 things. Number 1. The petrodollar was the most consequential financial deal of the 20th century, and it was never voted on, never publicly debated, and never formally disclosed to the world. Number 2, the military interventions in Iraq and Libya cannot be fully understood without understanding the petrodollar. Follow the money, always. Number 3, the dollar's dominance is eroding. Slowly, but the trend is clear, and it has serious implications for inflation, interest rates, and American living standards for decades to come. Here is the open question I want to leave you with. If the petrodollar era is ending, and the evidence suggests it is, what replaces it? A Chinese yuan system would simply substitute one hegemon for another? A basket of currencies? A digital settlement layer? Gold again? Nobody knows. And that uncertainty is exactly why this story is the most important financial story of our time.
If you found this video valuable, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because next, we're going deep on the BRICS currency project and whether it can actually dethrone the dollar or whether it will collapse under its own contradictions. The answer might surprise you. See you there.